Suddenly he said, "There was a murder done earlier, wasn't there? Just back there." And he pointed back the way I'd come. "Yes. How did you learn of it?" I asked him sharply. He snorted and rubbed his grimy claw across his face. "Murder? Everyone hears about it, and they don't talk about nothing else for days." "What's your name?" I asked him. "Raggy Jeb, they call me," he replied. "You can ask anyone round here, they all know me." "You have a surname?" "Fisher," he said. "They give me that name at the workhouse, on account I was fished out of the river when I was a baby. Someone threw me in like I was a bag of rubbish, and my swaddling clothes got caught up on a spar and kept me afloat long enough for me to be rescued." Then, hardened by my experiences though I was, I received such a shock that I let out a cry of alarm, for the tarpaulin moved, and the rags, and the first thought to flash through my mind was that a rat had hitched a ride, but it was far worse. A small, very small hand emerged from the tarpaulin, and tiny fingers gripped the edge to pull it back. And I reached out and snatched it back, and there before me, crouched amongst the rags, was a child. A little girl, perhaps no more than 4 or 5, with long, tangled fair hair, and the bright eyes of something feral. Appalled, I demanded of Fisher, "Who is this?" He gave a hoarse chuckle. "Why, she's my granddaughter. She often comes with me when I do my rounds." "What do you mean by putting a child on this barrow amongst all that filth?" I almost shouted at him. "Well, she's learning the trade," he said. "At her age? She's an infant." "Never too young. She's very good for businesses, Suki." "I sent her to the door and I'll wait by the barrow. They might refuse me, see. They say they got nothing, just to be rid of me. But they don't like to refuse her. They tell her to wait, and they dig out something nice, something of pretty colour." "But what is she doing under there, that dirty tarpaulin, unspeakable rags?" "Well, keeping warm, ain't she?" "Cold night. She's nice and snug in there." "But the risk of disease," I protested. "She was born among the rags, and she lives among the rags, same as her mother and all my family. We don't catch no diseases. There's no healthier man than a rag picker. Say good night to the officers, Suki." "Night, sir," piped the child, and scrabbled back under the tarpaulin. "We'll be home before long, sir," said her grandfather. I watched him leave. I had not physically touched the fellow, or his unsavoury load of rags, but my skin itched. Well, I do write several series, and The Dead Woman of Deptford is one of the Victorian series. And I have to sort of try and move around London a little bit, and I decided to put it in Deptford because it was such a busy place and the docks were still busy. And I must say they had for me a very nice cover, because it shows you the rats. And that's why I picked Deptford, although when I went there to research it, I'm afraid poor Deptford's virtually disappeared, and it was after the war, you know, the planners pulled down much of the old buildings, although they were all right, but they did rather make a mess of Deptford, and of course the docks have gone. But there's little bits left. You can see little bits as you go around. Why a crime series in a historical setting is many years ago in another existence I did write romantic novels, historical romantic novels. I had written three modern series, and I decided I would like to go back and try my hand at writing a Victorian series, because I have such admiration for those Victorian police officers. By the 1860s, the office at Scotland Yard had a proper criminal investigation department, and it had plainclothes officers and so on. So it was a very good time to write. But they were so intrepid, and they had to be so ingenious because they had absolutely nothing to help them. No fingerprints, because although the principle of fingerprinting was understood, there was no sort of way in which they had been sorted out into a manner in which they could be referenced. So they had nothing like that. They did not even have their own transport. They had to take public transport, they had to walk. If they took public transport, they could apply for a refund of the cost, but it wasn't guaranteed because the police were rather stingy in that way. So they really had everything against them, and they just had to go out there and do what they could into very violent situations. So I thought, yes, I would like to write about them. Well, one of the most tricky things I found when researching the book was trying to find out where the police station was in Deptford in the 1860s. I knew it wasn't where the present one is, and there is one further up the hill which was the police station, I think, in about the 1880s, and is now an arts centre. But I wanted to know the 1860s. So I went into the newest one, the modern one, and said, did they know? And they were very helpful, but they didn't know. And they suggested various places, and I contacted the museum, the police museum, and asked them, and they tried to find out, but nobody seemed to know. And in the end, I decided I could put it pretty well where I liked, because it seems to have been lost. I think there was more than one station. They had several dotted around. I'm a shameless watcher of people, and I think you see such interesting people, and you can't help, well, at least this is me, I suppose, this is something that I do, you can't help speculating a bit about them. And sometimes you see people who look very interesting and you think they must have a past history. And of course, I don't know what it is, but I start to invent one. And I've got a sort of imagination that works that way. And that's how it happens, I'm afraid. Well, they had to get married, Lizzie and Ben. In the first couple of books, they weren't married, and she worked as a lady's companion. But the trouble was she couldn't be free to go off and help him with his detecting, which she likes to do. She meddles, he thinks, but she does it very successfully. So I had to find a way in which they could be together, and she would have time to go off and make all her inquiries. And the only way I could do it in the 1860s was to marry them off, so that's what I did. And they seem to get along all right. I think he gets a bit frustrated with her interference, but she is helpful. When I start writing, you always have an idea in your head. You think you're going to do this and this. And when you come to do it, sometimes it just doesn't work out, or it doesn't feel right, or it doesn't feel natural, or you have a better idea, or something else crops up. So I kind of drift along and see what's coming next. If I don't know what's coming next, hopefully the reader doesn't know what's coming next. It's always fun getting to know new characters and creating new characters. I like writing about the other ones too, the characters I already know. I do feel I know them. The Mitchell and Markby series ran to 15 books, and the reason that I came to an end at 15 was because I had to take the actual relationship between the two characters forward somehow, and it was difficult to do that without changing the basis on which they worked. So if I married them, they wouldn't have the independence of action that they had. And if I split them up, I'd get agonized letters from readers who will seem to be very fond of them. So I paused there. But I do believe that any series has a kind of natural point which you should stop, either for a little while or even completely, but at least take a break. You need to take a break and step back and perhaps do something else, which is what I did. It's been a long career, and I started with an ordinary typewriter, and I do remember, and goodness knows how I managed. And Tipex, that's all I had. And then I had an electric typewriter. I thought I was really getting on then. And then I was told I should be getting a computer. So this was in the early days of computers. So I got a Commodore Amiga. Does anybody remember? Still got it up in my loft. I think it's a collectible. Anyway, I got this thing, and the first thing I wrote on it, I managed to lose the whole lot. And had to start again and reconstruct the whole thing. So I thought, I'm not sure about this gizmo. I think I was better off with a typewriter. But I persevered, so I do work on the computer now, and it's made a big difference, obviously. You work much faster. I don't know that you work better, because when you go faster, you can get a bit sort of ahead of yourself, Of course, I've seen changes over the last few years in crime fiction, and some of them have been for the better, and some of them I do wonder a little bit about. I think it's got a little bit too bloodthirsty. I think there are some occasions when it comes a little bit close to horror. But then, on the other hand, any crime fiction writer writes the book that's in him or in her to write, and so they're all going to be different. I just do what I do, and hopefully I've moved on with the times. When I wrote the first Mitchell and Markby books, which is in the early 1990s, the poor fellow didn't even have a mobile phone. And every time he wanted to get in touch with his base, he had to go back to his car and radio in, And of course, they didn't have a computer. Gradually, I think, halfway through the series, they got mobile phones. And I thought, gosh, they're making great progress, Seems rather sort of quite sad, really, when you think back. Sort of innocence about that. I hope that people will enjoy The Dead Woman of Deptford. I think one of the things I hope that it does show is how important the river was in London, the docks, the working on the docks, working around the docks, and how a whole life that really buzzed with every kind of incident, and after all the ships that came in from all over the world there, and there were foreign voices of every kind to be heard off the ships. And indeed, there's a mention here of the Seamen's Hospital that was set up, which was actually on a ship. And I hope that that does sort of perhaps paint a picture a bit for people who don't have any memory of that, and maybe they will like it.